60 feet of solid granite face, a nose wide enough to land a small plane on, eyes carved with such precision that from the right angle they seem to catch the light and follow you as you walk past. And yet, for all that scale and precision, Mount Rushmore was never actually finished. Behind Abraham Lincoln's head, a narrow tunnel drills 70 feet into the mountain, leading toward a chamber that was supposed to safeguard copies of America's founding documents forever. Work on it stopped abruptly, and it has remained inaccessible to the public ever since. To understand why one of the most recognizable monuments on the planet still stands incomplete, and why the land underneath it carries one of the country's oldest broken promises, you have to go back almost a century to a young state trying to put itself on the map. In the early 1920s, South Dakota was struggling. It had only been a state for a few decades, and while nearby attractions like the Black Hills and Wind Cave were drawing automobile tourists, the state's historian, Doane Robinson, wanted something bigger, something that would put South Dakota on every traveler's list. He'd read about a massive Confederate memorial being carved into a mountainside in Georgia, and it gave him an idea. Why not carve something just as monumental into the granite of the Black Hills? Robinson's first vision wasn't presidents. He imagined heroes of the American West, explorers Lewis and Clark, showman Buffalo Bill Cody, and Lakota leaders like Red Cloud and Crazy Horse, carved into a formation of granite spires known as the Needles. In 1924, he reached out to the sculptor behind that Georgia memorial, a driven and controversial artist named Gutzon Borglum, and asked him to come take a look. Borglum arrived with his own ideas. He rejected the needles almost immediately. The spires were too thin and unstable to carry the kind of carving he had in mind. He also rejected Robinson's regional cast of characters. If this was going to be worth doing, Borglum argued, it needed to be national in scope, a monument to the whole country, not just South Dakota. He proposed 4 United States presidents instead: George Washington, symbolizing the nation's founding; Thomas Jefferson, its westward expansion; Theodore Roosevelt, its development; and Abraham Lincoln, its preservation through the Civil War. In the summer of 1925, scouting the area, Borglum found the site he wanted, a massive southeast-facing cliff of fine-grained granite, catching sunlight for most of the day. Locally, it was already known by a name that had nothing to do with any president. Decades earlier, a New York attorney named Charles Rushmore had been in the area checking mining claims, and when he'd casually asked his guide what the mountain was called, the guide simply told him it didn't have a name, but it did now. The Black Hills had held sacred meaning for generations, and the Lakota knew this mountain as Thongkashila Shakpe, the 6 grandfathers. To grasp just how large this canvas actually was, each finished face stands about 60 feet tall, with noses stretching roughly 20 feet, eyes about 11 feet wide, and mouths close to 18 feet across, all on a cliff rising over 5,700 feet above sea level. Getting the project approved wasn't simple. Conservationists in the Black Hills didn't want the landscape altered, and plenty of locals worried about an influx of tourists changing their communities for the worse. It took 2 years of lobbying by Robinson and Borglum before South Dakota's legislature narrowly approved the project in 1925, and even then, no state money came with it. This would have to be paid for privately, and later, through matching federal funds Borglum spent years chasing down. A formal dedication ceremony was held in August 1927, with President Calvin Coolidge in attendance, and actual carving began that October. Congress finally authorized matching federal funds in early 1929, just before Coolidge left office. And then, the changeover to a new administration under Herbert Hoover delayed the first payment for months, leaving Borglum to keep the project afloat on private donations in the meantime. Turning a 5-foot clay model into a monument hundreds of feet tall required more than ambition. It required a completely new kind of engineering. Borglum adapted an old sculptural pointing technique used to transfer measurements from a model to a finished work. He built his own version, a swinging metal arm with a weighted plumb line that could measure the angle, and the horizontal and vertical distance of any point on his scale model. Multiply each of those three numbers by 12, and you had the exact coordinates of that same point on the mountain. He then built a much larger version of the same device directly on top of Mount Rushmore and used it to mark thousands of individual points across the cliff face, telling his crews exactly where and exactly how deep to carve. The actual removal of rock relied overwhelmingly on dynamite. Around 90% of the material taken off the mountain, roughly 450,000 tons of granite in total, came down through carefully placed charges, often stripping away just a few inches of rock at a time to avoid damaging what lay beneath. Once the rough shape of a face emerged, crews switched to a method called honeycombing, drilling a tight grid of holes close together to weaken the remaining rock, which could then be broken away, often by hand, without the risk of a full blast. Finally came the fine detail work, done with pneumatic jackhammers weighing around 30 kilograms apiece, powered by compressed air pumped from a plant at the base of the mountain through 2,000 feet of pipe, all the way to the workers' platforms near the summit. Up to 16 jackhammers could run at once. The final surface was smoothed using a technique called bumping, which pulverized the outer layer of stone into a lighter, whiter finish. The eyes were the hardest part of all. A flat, smooth, sculpted eye looks lifeless from a distance, so Borglum's carvers cut a deep pocket into each eye that would always sit in shadow, then deliberately left a small, uncut column of granite at the center to catch the light, creating the illusion of a gleaming, reflective pupil. Cutting that column meant leaving a projecting piece of granite vulnerable to breaking during carving, hundreds of feet above the ground. Much of that fine detail work fell to Luigi Del Bianco, an Italian immigrant stonemason who served as the memorial's chief carver. Borglum specifically wanted someone who understood sculptural language well enough to bring genuine emotion into a president's granite face, not just replicate a shape, and Del Bianco was the one trusted to finish the expressions that made the four presidents look less like blocks of stone and more like men. None of this was safe work. Nearly 400 people worked on the memorial over 14 years, while the carving crews spent their days suspended in bosun chairs hundreds of feet above the ground, running heavy jackhammers and handling dynamite for Depression-era wages that varied by job and skill. And yet, across all 14 years, not a single worker died on the project, a remarkable safety record for a job that involved blasting a mountain apart by hand. Face by face, the presidents emerged. Washington's was dedicated on July 4, 1930. Jefferson's likeness was originally meant to sit on Washington's right side, but after the carving had already begun, the rock there turned out to be too unstable, so the partly finished figure was blown apart and an entirely new Jefferson was carved into the other side instead, dedicated in 1936. Lincoln followed in 1937. The same year, a bill reached Congress proposing a fifth face for the mountain, women's rights leader Susan B. Anthony, though lawmakers instead passed a rider restricting federal money to only the heads already underway, quietly closing the door on any addition. Roosevelt's face, the last of the four, was dedicated in 1939. Through all of it, the project doubled as a rare source of steady paychecks in a region hit hard by the Great Depression, kept alive as much by federal relief funding as by any grand artistic vision. The plan had always been for far more than four faces. Each president was originally meant to be carved down to the waist, and Borglum had also designed a hall of records, a vault cut deep into the mountain behind Lincoln's head, meant to house engraved copies of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the story of how Mount Rushmore itself had been built, so that the memorial could explain itself to whoever found it thousands of years in the future. Workers only managed to cut about 70 feet into the rock before funding ran out and priorities shifted back to finishing the faces. In March 1941, Gutzon Borglum died following complications from surgery, and his son Lincoln Borglum took over the final months of the project. By October, with funding exhausted and America's entry into World War II approaching, the project was declared complete. The presidents would never get their bodies, and the Hall of Records remained little more than a rough-cut shaft until 1998, when the National Park Service placed a titanium vault containing 16 porcelain enamel historical panels beneath a granite capstone in the floor near its entrance, still closed to public access today. The total cost of the entire memorial came to $989,992.32. That's the story Mount Rushmore tells about itself, a state that dreamed big, an eccentric sculptor with an engineering breakthrough, and 4 presidential faces carved with nothing but dynamite, hand tools, and Depression-era grit. But it isn't the whole story, and the rest of it starts long before Borglum ever set foot in South Dakota. The Black Hills had been recognized in writing as belonging to the Lakota people. The 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie set the region aside as part of the Great Sioux Reservation, guaranteeing it to them for as long as the Lakota, who consider the Black Hills sacred ground, calling the region the heart of everything that is, wish to keep it. That promise lasted less than a decade. In 1874, an Army expedition led by George Armstrong Custer confirmed gold in the Black Hills, triggering a rush of prospectors onto reservation land. Rather than enforce the treaty, the United States moved to break it. After a brief war, Congress passed legislation in 1877 simply seizing the Black Hills outright, transferring the very mountain that would one day carry 4 presidential faces out of Lakota hands. 50 years later, the man chosen to carve those faces was already a controversial figure. Before South Dakota, Borglum had been the original sculptor on the Confederate Memorial at Stone Mountain, Georgia, a project the Ku Klux Klan itself had helped bankroll and champion, and whose national leaders Borglum socialized with for years, even stepping in to settle internal disputes among them. Historians still debate how deep his personal beliefs ran versus how much was simple opportunism, but Borglum's own letters make plain that he saw Stone Mountain and Mount Rushmore as companion projects, describing the South Dakota Memorial, in his own words, as a northern counterpart equal in scale to the southern one. His writings from the period also reveal nativist, anti-Semitic views and explicit convictions about Nordic racial superiority. None of this history is prominently told at Mount Rushmore itself today. Even the 4 faces Borglum chose come with their own complicated legacies among native nations. Washington had long been known among the Haudenosaunee as Town Destroyer, a name that took on even darker meaning after his 1779 Sullivan Campaign burned dozens of native towns and their crops. Theodore Roosevelt was an outspoken supporter of forced assimilation policies, and is on the historical record making one of the most notoriously brutal remarks about Native Americans ever attributed to a U.S. president. The monument built to honor the nation's founding, expansion, growth, and preservation was, for the people whose sacred mountain it sits on, a monument to exactly the opposite. The legal reckoning eventually came, just not the kind that returned any land. In 1980, the U.S. Supreme Court held in United States versus Sioux Nation of Indians that the 1877 taking of the Black Hills required just compensation under the Fifth Amendment and ordered a payment of roughly $105 million, calculated from the land's original value plus over a century of interest. The Sioux Nations refused to accept a single dollar. Taking the payment, they argued, would legally treat the Black Hills as sold, and the Black Hills, as far as the Lakota are concerned, were never for sale. That money has sat untouched in a federal trust account ever since, quietly compounding interest for more than 4 decades. The unclaimed award is widely estimated to have grown beyond $1 billion, making it one of the largest unclaimed judgments in American history, because the people it was meant for don't want the cash. They want the mountain back. The mountain hasn't stood still since 1941 either. Engineers now track hairline cracks across the granite using electronic monitors sensitive to fractions of a millimeter, and mountaineers rappel down the president's faces every year to reseal them, since Borglum's original linseed oil sealant eventually failed. In 2005, a German manufacturer even ran a free cleaning operation, blasting decades of lichen off the granite with pressurized hot water. And the idea of adding more faces never entirely went away. It's been floated for John F. Kennedy after his assassination, for Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, and again in the 1990s, and public figures have joked about their own odds ever since. Though geologists have long said the remaining rock isn't stable enough to support new carving. Not far away, in the same Black Hills, construction has continued for decades on the Crazy Horse Memorial, an unofficial answer to Rushmore honoring the Lakota leader, one that, if ever finished, would dwarf the four presidents in size. That standoff over the land itself is still very much alive. Some native leaders, and, at times, even Borglum's own descendants, have called for the monument to be taken down entirely. Others, including many South Dakotans who depend on it, point to Mount Rushmore's status as one of South Dakota's biggest tourist attractions, pulling in around 2 million visitors a year, and argue it should be preserved and better contextualized rather than erased. Proposals for a middle path have included joint management of parts of the Black Hills between the federal government and Lakota communities, though nothing has been settled. In 1971, activists from the American Indian movement occupied the site and renamed it Mount Crazy Horse in protest. Demonstrations over the monument's meaning have continued in the decades since, including in 2020. So here's where that leaves things. A monument nicknamed the Shrine of Democracy, carved by a man with ties to a hate group on a mountain taken from its original owners through a broken treaty, still missing the bodies, the inscriptions, and the sealed vault of documents its own sculptor considered essential to the design, and sitting a short distance from $1 billion payment nobody has ever cashed, because what's owed was never really about money. Barring some dramatic change in that standoff, the four faces are likely to remain on the mountain for generations to come. Whether the story people tell about them changes is a different question entirely. If you enjoyed this look at one of America's most audacious and most complicated engineering projects, subscribe for more deep dives into the history behind humanity's greatest structures, and let us know in the comments which monument, bridge, or mega project you want us to tackle next.